Ever get that feeling that learning UX design has somehow gone off the rails?
I mean, like it's all theory and jargon now?
Exactly. Like it's become this, academic exercise instead of just making things work better for people.
Yeah.
Our source today basically says just that a lot of the education side has become this kind of gatekeeping thing.
Right.
Forgetting that UX is really about, practical problem solving at its heart.
Absolutely.
So today, we're going to fire up our internal bullshit detector, as they call it, and try to sift through and find what actually counts.
And what's cool is where this perspective comes from. We're digging into the No Bullshit Guide to UX by Angeline Wallace and Michal Malewicz. And this isn't like theory from a distance. It's based on their own 20-plus years in the trenches.
Wow, 20 years.
Yeah, and over 500 projects. So it's grounded in, real-world experience.
Yeah.
Unfiltered advice.
Totally. And so for you listening, maybe you're prepping for a meeting or you're just trying to finally get what UX is all about, or hey, maybe you're just curious. This deep dive is really about cutting through the noise, giving you a clear, no-nonsense look at the core ideas and, the realities of UX.
Right, regardless of your background. We're aiming for actionable stuff,
Yeah.
A view without all the usual jargon overload.
Our mission, then, is pretty straightforward. Pull out the key insights, what UX really is, how it's actually done day to day.
And importantly, what you should maybe focus on.
Yeah, and what might be less critical. The authors are definitely candid, sometimes even a bit contrarian, maybe.
Definitely. It's all based on that deep experience they have.
Okay, so let's jump in. The big question first. Why do we even do UX?
Right.
They start with this story about a startup way back in 2001, which feels like ancient history in tech, right?
Totally ancient. And this company did really well, apparently without any, formal UX person or process.
So what was going on? How did that work?
Well, the key thing they point out is this cycle they were using almost subconsciously. It was basically design something, test it, see how people react, and then tweak it, repeat.
That core loop.
Exactly. That fundamental design, test, repeat idea. It sometimes gets buried under all the methodologies and fancy terms we've piled on top of UX since then.
Yeah, and they contrast that with what came later, this idea of the all-knowing UX guru.
Oh, yeah.
And this tendency to really overcomplicate things. So, in their view, stripping it back, what is UX?
Their definition is super direct. It's not just about making users happy, though that's part of it. It's fundamentally about achieving business goals.
Ah, the business side, profit.
Yeah, more profit usually. And you get there by making the user experience easy, maybe even fun, and definitely memorable.
Okay.
But it always comes back to that core loop.
Yeah.
Design, test, repeat, all driving towards those business outcomes.
Now, things can get a bit messy with all the acronyms, UI, UX, CX. How do they see these fitting together? Is there a hierarchy?
Yeah, they lay it out pretty clearly. Think of customer experience, CX, as the absolute top level, the big picture. It's every single touch point a customer has with the company. Not just the app or website, but marketing, support, the brand itself, everything.
Gotcha, the whole relationship.
Exactly. Then, user experience, UX, sits inside CX. It's specifically about the interaction with the actual product or service.
Right. Using the thing.
And then user interface, UI, is inside UX. That's the tangible stuff you see and touch on the screen.
The buttons, the colors, the layout.
Precisely.
Yep.
So UI is part of UX, and UX is part of CX. And they stress, all these levels matter. You can't really neglect any of them.
Makes sense. And what about this shift we've seen towards the title product designer? Why did that term gain traction?
Well, it seems the title UX designer started to feel a bit vague. Maybe too broad. It didn't always signal specific skills.
Okay.
Product designer usually implies someone who can handle both the UX thinking and the UI execution. Plus, usually some basic understanding of research and business needs.
So more versatile.
Yeah, exactly. Someone who can bridge those gaps and contribute across more of the development process. From the idea right through to the polished visuals, some see it as just a more complete description.
Okay, interesting. Let's switch gears a bit. There's a chapter title that definitely grabs your attention. The Curse of UX Agencies. Sounds like they might have some strong feelings here.
Oh, they do.
Yeah.
They talk about what they call the golden age for agencies, roughly 2008 to 2012.
Right when UX was really exploding.
Exactly. And with that boom came, opportunities for some maybe less than honest stuff.
Uh-oh.
They give this example of a 4-person agency team showing up to a meeting.
Okay.
But only one person really talks or contributes anything meaningful. Yet the client gets billed for all 4 people's time.
Ouch. That doesn't sound great. And what kind of work were these agencies pushing that maybe wasn't always needed?
Well, the typical package often involve things like really detailed personas, fictional user profiles.
Yeah, I've seen those.
Elaborate empathy maps, super detailed customer journey maps, storyboards, a whole stack of deliverables.
Right.
And the authors suggest these weren't always adding real value to the client. Sometimes it felt more about padding the invoice, using jargon to make it seem indispensable.
Inflating the budget, basically.
That seems to be the implication in some cases, yeah. Maximizing billable hours over delivering tangible results.
But they mentioned things started to change around 2013, 2014. What happened?
A couple things converged, really. Smartphones became ubiquitous,
Right.
right? So users, and therefore clients, just got way more tech savvy.
Yeah, people started having opinions about apps.
Exactly. Clients started recognizing good design patterns. They even started, sketching out their own basic wireframes sometimes. Tools became more accessible.
Right.
Plus, analytics tools like Hotjar gave clients direct visibility into how users were actually interacting with their sites. They didn't need an agency to tell them everything anymore. They started asking tougher questions.
So they got smarter and pushed back a bit.
Pretty much. They became more discerning about where the real value was.
So, pulling back from that chapter, what's the main takeaway? The moral of the story?
It really boils down to honesty and integrity. Just be straight with clients.
Yeah.
Charge a fair price for good, solid work that actually helps them. Don't try to pad things out with unnecessary fluff, because ultimately that kind of thing just erodes trust and hurts the whole field.
Makes sense. Okay, this leads us neatly into another chapter with a pretty provocative title, Evil UX. What are they getting at here?
This one tackles that inherent tension, doesn't it? Between the ideal of UX helping users and the reality that businesses need to make money.
Right, the profit motive.
Exactly. And they introduce this concept of dark patterns, which are basically design tricks.
Tricks? How so?
They're intentionally misleading designs, things built to nudge you or even trick you into doing something you probably wouldn't do otherwise, something that benefits the company, not necessarily you.
Can you give some examples? What does that look like in practice?
Oh, sure. Think about those tiny, hard-to-find X buttons to close ads.
Ugh, yeah. Hate those.
Or really confusing privacy settings, maybe using double negatives so you accidentally agree to share more data than you meant to.
Sneaky.
Hidden auto renewals for subscriptions are a classic one. And then making the cancellation process incredibly difficult or hidden.
Yeah, the cancellation maze.
Exactly. The authors point out that designers in many companies face real pressure from management or stakeholders to implement these kinds of patterns.
So what happens if a designer pushes back? Says, no, this isn't right, it's manipulative.
Well, that's the tough part, isn't it? The book suggests the consequences can be pretty serious. You might risk getting fired.
Wow.
Or feeling like you have to quit because it goes against your ethics. Or just facing constant conflict and stress within your job. It highlights a really difficult ethical tightrope some designers have to walk.
Yeah, that's a heavy reality check. Okay, maybe shifting to something slightly lighter. UX tropes. What common sayings or ideas are they taking aim at?
The big one they tackle right away is that classic, super simplistic phrase, UI is how it looks, UX is how it works.
Ah, yes, the meme version.
Right. They really push back on that. Their argument is that how something looks is part of how it works. Aesthetics aren't just decoration. They fundamentally affect usability.
How so?
Well, think about it. If an interface is ugly, cluttered, hard to read, users get frustrated, right? They might not trust it, they might miss things, they might just give up entirely. The visuals directly impact the experience.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
They also bring up that old ketchup bottle analogy, don't they?
They do, you know the one.
Yeah.
Glass bottle looks nicer, UI, plastic squeeze bottle is easier to use UX.
Right.
But they challenge even that simple explanation. They point out, well, sometimes the squeeze bottle makes a bigger mess.
Uh-huh, true.
And more seriously, they bring up the longer-term impact, like plastic particles from the bottle. Their point isn't really about ketchup, obviously.
All right.
It's that we need to evaluate things more deeply, from multiple angles, not just settle for the first, most obvious explanation. Consider the whole picture.
Good point. Okay, let's get into the core activity, design itself. How do the authors actually define design in this context?
They define it very broadly, fundamentally, as problem solving.
Yeah.
And they make a point that it doesn't always have to be visual.
Oh, non-visual.
Like just telling a developer, hey, put a standard save button here. The design decision happened in that instruction, even without a visual mockup.
Interesting.
But then they quickly focus in on what most people mean in this field. Digital product design. So apps, websites, they also nod to the future. AR, VR, that sort of thing.
And what's their view on using standard ways of doing things, like for login screens or sign-up forms? Should designers always try to be original?
No, quite the opposite, actually. They're big advocates for using established patterns for common interactions.
Like login, registration, stuff everyone does.
Exactly. The best practices for those are pretty well understood. There's usually no good reason to reinvent the wheel and confuse people.
So where does the skill come in then?
They argue the real skill is in quickly and effectively applying those patterns, knowing when to use what and adapting it slightly if needed, but mostly avoiding unnecessary complexity. Efficiency over novelty, basically.
Got it. They also talk about the rule of clicks, this idea that you should always minimize clicks. What's their take?
They warn against being dogmatic about it, like that old 3-click rule isn't really a hard rule.
Oh, okay.
What matters more, they say, is the structure of the information. Is it logical? Does it make sense to the user?
So fewer clicks isn't always better.
Not necessarily. Sometimes breaking a long, complex process into, say, 5 clear, simple steps is much better than trying to cram it all into 2 confusing screens just to reduce clicks.
Manageable chunks.
Exactly. Focus on one thing per step. And crucially, always show users where they are in the process. That progress bar or step indicator really helps reduce overwhelm.
Makes sense. Okay, let's talk about roles. Design roles. The authors seem a bit critical of all the hyper-specialized job titles out there.
Yeah, they definitely express some skepticism about those really long niche titles, suggesting they might be more about appearances sometimes.
So what do they boil it down to? What are the core roles?
They simplify it quite a bit. Essentially 3 main roles, plus a kind of bonus one they really value. You've got the designer, the researcher, and the writer.
Okay, designer, researcher, writer.
And the bonus one is the generalist. They also stress that, realistically, there needs to be overlap. People need to understand a bit of each other's domains to work well together.
Right. So can you break down what each of those main roles does, in their view?
Sure. The designer is someone who should be comfortable working across different levels of detail, from mapping out user flows to wireframes, right up to polished, high-fidelity prototypes.
Including visuals.
Yeah, UI is definitely part of it. And they suggest basic motion design, like micro-interactions, should be in their toolkit too.
Okay. And the researcher?
The researcher is focused on, well, research, planning studies, conducting them, analyzing the data, both quantitative analytics and qualitative stuff like interviews.
Do they need design skills?
They need basic understanding, yeah. Enough to communicate findings effectively to designers and understand the context. Researchers are more common in larger organizations, they know.
And the writer?
The writer handles the actual words in the product. Microcopy on buttons, error messages, onboarding text, help guides, all that stuff.
But they mention this often gets done by designers.
Yeah, especially in smaller companies, the designer often ends up doing the UX writing. So it can be a somewhat limited standalone role sometimes.
Gotcha. And then the generalist, they seem keen on this one.
Very keen. The generalist is someone who combines skills from all 3 areas: research, design, including UI and writing.
Jack or Jill of all trades.
Kind of, yeah. They argue this role is super valuable, especially in small to medium companies, because it cuts down on communication overhead. One person has the whole picture.
Less handing things off.
Exactly. More integrated thinking. And interestingly, they suggest that top-tier generalists can actually command the highest salaries, even in big companies. Their advice is generally to aim for that broader skill set, if you can.
Interesting path. Okay, next up. Design thinking. That's a term you hear constantly. What's the author's take?
They define it as, that structured process. Empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test. A framework for tackling design problems.
But they're not totally sold on it being the only way?
Right. They acknowledge it's popular and can be useful, especially for providing structure. But they also stress it's not mandatory, not always the most efficient path.
Compared to their design, test, repeat.
Exactly, which is maybe a more direct, less formalized version of the same underlying principles.
So how do they frame those design thinking steps, maybe with their slightly more pragmatic lens?
Yeah, they give it a bit of a real-world spin. Empathize is about understanding users, sure, but maybe not needing to become a licensed psychologist.
Right, practical empathy?
Define the problem. They point out that while it sounds user-focused, let's be real, the business goals are almost always a major driver behind what problem gets defined.
Okay, fair point.
Ideate is just brainstorming. Get ideas out there, don't judge them too early. Prototype is building a quick dummy version to test. They really recommend testing with real users, using prototypes that feel as real as possible. High fidelity if you can.
Get better feedback that way.
Yeah. And test is just seeing how people react to your prototype and feeding those insights back into the earlier stages, refining things.
So the overall message is,
don't get bogged down in the specific labels or steps of design thinking as dogma. Focus on the core. Understand the problem, come up with a potential solution, and test the heck out of it with actual users.
Makes sense. Let's talk research. Now, the authors ran a UX research company, so they should know this area well. What's their core reality check about research?
The big one is that despite its importance, smaller clients especially often just want to skip it. They're eager to see visual designs, mock-ups.
Impatient for the pixels.
Exactly. But the authors argue you actually can't not do research. Even if it's just looking at competitor apps or remembering past project feedback, that is a form of research.
Ah, okay. It's unavoidable.
Pretty much. The issue is more about how it's presented, how formal it needs to be, and how much effort is justified. They also suggest leveraging the collective knowledge already out there from thousands of existing apps and sites.
So how do they define research in a really simple, practical way?
They cut right through the jargon. It's basically just asking users questions and using their answers to make the product better.
That's it?
Pretty much their core definition. They use the analogy of a waiter asking how you'd like your steak cooked. Simple information gathering to guide the outcome. Doesn't have to be some big, scary scientific process every time.
Okay. And they touch on qualitative versus quantitative research. What's the difference and what do they recommend?
Right. Quantitative is about numbers, stats, like what percentage of users click this button. Good for seeing high-level trends, but often misses the why.
The context.
Exactly. Qualitative is about the why. Open-ended questions, interviews, observations. Gives you much deeper understanding, but it takes more time to gather and analyze.
So which is better?
Their advice is generally, start with quantitative data if you have it, get the big picture, but really lean on qualitative when you need to solve a problem or understand user motivations and frustrations.
Dig deeper with qualitative.
Yeah. And they really encourage just talking to users regularly, even informally. Keep asking questions.
Good advice. Now, this next chapter, The Things We Do, sounds like it gets really practical about specific UX methods. They use a traffic light system, red, orange, green.
Yeah, it's a really useful framing. Green means almost always used and essential. Orange means sometimes useful depending on the project. And red means, in their experience, rarely used in actual day-to-day work, even if they pop up in courses or portfolios.
Okay, let's start with the red light methods, the ones they see as rarely used in practice. What's on that list?
It's quite a long list, actually. Personas are first up. They say, yeah, maybe okay for juniors learning empathy, but in real projects, they often contain made-up or irrelevant info. Data-driven customer models are preferred.
Okay, so personas out. What else?
Proto-personas, which are basically personas made without research, just assumptions. Often seen as filler for presentations. Empathy maps, usually based on those questionable personas, often just a theoretical exercise yielding obvious answers, replaced by actual user feedback and segmentation.
What about wireframes?
Specifically low-fidelity wireframes. They argue users react poorly to the lack of detail now, and with current tools, mid-fidelity is often just as fast and gives better feedback. Similarly, low-fidelity sketches done in meetings are often messy and useless later. Digital is faster and clearer.
Any other methods in the red zone?
Yep. Affinity diagrams, sorting sticky notes. They say this just happens naturally when analyzing data. Giving it a fancy name isn't necessary for experienced folks. Storyboards can be okay for case studies, but bullet points are usually faster for actual communication. Crazy eights, that rapid sketching exercise, often yields mediocre ideas as people default to patterns. Good designers find patterns mentally faster. Eye tracking expensive often just confirms known UI best practices, though maybe a comeback with AR. And card sorting for information architecture often unnecessary as good practices exist, and users might not understand the cards well anyway.
Wow, okay, that clears out a lot of commonly taught methods. What about the orange light ones they sometimes used?
These are more context dependent. Customer journey maps, mapping the user's path over time, can be useful if it hasn't been done before, or to get everyone on the same page. Simplified versions are more common. Customer experience maps, broader than journey maps, includes marketing, sales, etc., usually handled by those teams, not core UX work. Design systems libraries of reusable components and guidelines. Great for large, complex products with big teams.
But maybe overkill for smaller projects.
Exactly. Can be more work to maintain than they say for simple products. And finally, discovery workshop sessions to understand client problems and goals. Becoming less frequent, they say, as clients often come better prepared with data now.
Okay, that makes sense. So finally, the green light methods, the absolute essentials, according to them.
These are the ones they see as fundamental. Competitive analysis, you have to look at what competitors are doing, what works, what doesn't. Essential.
Always.
User interviews, actually talking to users. Often done efficiently via short online surveys now, but still crucial for understanding needs and attitudes. Usability testing, watching real users try to complete tasks with your prototype, ideally mid to high fidelity. Recording what they do and say without leading them. Foundational.
Mouse is green.
Movement tracking on websites using heat maps, scroll maps to see actual behavior and spot problems. A/B testing, testing different versions live. Useful, but they add a caution about potential for dark patterns and recommend doing usability testing first.
Good caveat.
And lastly, heuristic evaluation. Applying established usability principles, like Jacob Nielsen's famous 10 heuristics, which they explain simply, to assess a design. Standard practice, especially for auditing existing products.
That traffic light system is super practical, really clarifies where experienced folks tend to focus their energy. Okay, let's talk laws of UX. These often sound quite academic. How do the authors handle them?
They basically translate them into plain English with actionable advice. They acknowledge the principles are useful, but the traditional language can be dense.
Okay, so give us the simplified versions. What are some key ones?
Sure. Hick's law becomes minimize choices. Too many options leads to confusion and delay. Just show what's necessary. Jacob's law is don't be too original. Users expect things to work like other sites they use. Consistency beats novelty for its own sake.
Familiarity is good.
Right. Fitt's law translates to big touch targets. Make buttons easy to hit, especially on mobile. Follow platform guidelines on minimum size.
Makes sense.
The goal gradient effect is almost done. People try harder when they feel close to finishing. So, show progress. Pre-fill forms where you can. The Doty threshold is instant access. Users hate waiting. Use loading indicators, skeleton screens if there's a delay.
Keep it snappy.
Miller's law becomes reduced complexity. Our short-term memory is limited, so break big tasks into small, logical chunks. Group-related info, Occam's razor is simple is best. If you have multiple ways to solve something, pick the simplest one. Remove clutter.
Less is more.
And finally, the aesthetics usability effect is basically pretty feels better. Visually appealing things are often perceived as easier to use even if they aren't technically perfect. So don't neglect visual clarity and appeal.
Those are really clear, useful translations. Okay, wrapping up, they have a section on what's next. What kind of practical process or testing flow do they suggest?
They outline a kind of iterative loop as a good practice. It goes something like, start with competitive analysis. Look at existing user comments and analytics. Build a high-fidelity prototype, ideally HTML if you can, for realism. Then run usability studies with that prototype. Iterate on the design based on the feedback. That may be coded up. Optionally, you could do some A/B testing live.
And then keep going.
Exactly. Continuously gather feedback, more user interviews, check App Store comments, watch analytics. Then use that to inform the next round of redesign and more usability studies. Repeat, repeat, repeat.
It's never really done.
That's the core message. UX is an ongoing cycle of improvement.
And they mentioned their book isn't static either, right?
Yeah, they frame it as a work in progress itself, something that will evolve with feedback from the community, just like the field itself keeps changing. They end by just encouraging people to experiment and focus on making great products.
Great stuff. So bringing this whole deep dive into the no bullshit guide to UX together, what's the single most important message you think people should take away?
I think the biggest thing is that UX, when you strip away the fluff, is about practical problem solving. It's about understanding what users actually need and what the business needs to achieve.
Not just following textbook steps.
Exactly. It's not about rigidly adhering to academic processes or chasing every new trend. It's about using experience, critical thinking, and that bullshit detector to figure out what actually works in the real world.
A very grounded perspective. Okay, and on that note, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. We talked about this tension, right? Between truly user-centered design and the pressure for profit, sometimes leading to evil UX. So the question is, what ethical responsibilities do people involved in making these digital products really have? Where does that line sit for you?
That's a huge question, definitely something to ponder. Well, thanks for joining us on this exploration of a very practical take on UX. We hope it gives you some useful food for thought as you navigate this always changing field.